Detroit is a city that has been in the national and world news once again. We're often in the news in the city of Detroit for various reasons. Of course, last year we had very good results from the Tigers, so that put us in the national news. But we're also in the news for other reasons that are not so positive. Since March, when Governor Rick Snyder declared a so-called financial emergency in Detroit, therefore setting the stage for the appointment of an emergency manager, many press reports drew a direct connection between the recent corruption trial of former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick and businessman Bobby Ferguson. In fact, just prior to Snyder's declaration, Kilpatrick and Ferguson were found guilty of numerous corruption charges in the months-long federal trial. Of course, the corporate and government-controlled media has never focused on who are the real culprits in the underdevelopment and consequent destruction of Detroit and other other majority African-American municipalities in Michigan. And it's interesting that all of the municipalities that are under emergency management have majority African-American populations. Therefore, that translates into the fact that at least half, perhaps more, of the African-American population in Michigan is under emergency management. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. Now, these media entities fall back on the same notions that have prevailed inside the United States since the period of Reconstruction, after the collapse of slavery, the Civil War, and the effort, although haphazard, to reconstruct democracy inside the United States. And that is that African-American political leadership is inherently corrupt and inefficient, and which renders them incapable of managing the affairs of governments locally, statewide, as well as nationally. And we hear this repeated all the time in the corporate media, that emergency management is the best solution for the people here in the city of Detroit. Now, beginning in the late 1990s, the city was the focus of one of the largest swindles in the history of the United States. Predatory lending schemes targeted African Americans and Latino communities in a massive profit-making project that involved the highest echelons of finance capital in collusion with the federal, state, and local governments. And we saw the results of some of that today on our corporate devastation tour. African Americans were deliberately lured into the first home buyer programs, refinancing programs, which the banks knew well in advance would result in massive home losses and the wholesale leveling and cleansing of neighborhoods as well as cities. These predatory lending programs in many cases were racist in character by only providing subprime loans to African Americans and Latinos, even if they qualified for what was considered as conventional mortgages. So what happened was that there was a whole industry developed around subprime lending. And what is subprime lending? It targets people who supposedly are first home buyers, who have lower incomes, who may have had credit problems, but what happens, they put them in mortgages that have high interest rates, and the way they're structured is very, very difficult to maintain them. So they knew well in advance that most people who were put in these subprime mortgages would not be able to pay for those homes in the long run. And this is, in part, what has helped destroy the city of Detroit. Even though you had African Americans who had good incomes, who may have had good credit ratings, they still were put into subprime mortgages. And in Detroit, over 85% of the mortgages in Detroit are subprime mortgages. Now, the largest and most profitable banks and insurance companies were involved in these efforts. Even though many of the mortgage loans appear to originate from small real estate and finance companies, over a period of time, the servicing of these loans wound up with some of the oldest and well-established banks, such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, the Royal Bank of Scotland, which owns Charter One Bank, Wells Fargo Bank, which is supposed to be the largest bank in the United States, the Bank of New York Mellon Trust, as well as others. These are well-established, multi-billion-dollar financial institutions that are based here in the United States, with the exception of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is based in the UK. Now, the forces behind these fraudulent mortgages packages were so-called securitized trusts and hedge funds. You may have heard about securitized trusts and hedge funds, many of which are based on Wall Street. So why were they investing in communities like Detroit, and even in so-called distressed communities and distressed properties? As I said, many of these institutions were based on Wall Street in New York City. The mortgages were bundled up in exotic financial instruments and backed up by multi-billion-dollar firms such as American International Group, AIG. It's a major insurance firm that's also based on Wall Street in New York. Utilizing credit default swaps, the CDSs, these trusts and funds bet on the fact that there would be a monumental and unprecedented foreclosures, and they reaped trillions of dollars in profits based upon the failure and destruction of municipalities throughout the United States. So they bet on the fact that people would not be successful in paying their mortgages, and they still got paid by betting against people's ability to stay in their homes. So they made money either way. If people were able to pay their mortgages, they got paid. If people defaulted on their mortgages, they got paid because insurance companies like AIG backed up the mortgages. So even if they failed, they still got paid for the full value of the mortgages, not the market value, but the full value of the mortgage itself. Now, in late 2006 and early 2007, these schemes began to unravel. Two Detroit-based attorneys associated with the Michigan Emergency Committee Against War and Injustice began to receive requests to defend hundreds of people from imminent foreclosure. What they discovered shortly was that people had been placed in adjustable rate mortgages, so-called ARMs, where they would start off paying a relatively manageable amount in a monthly payment, only to see these installments rise precipitously over a period of time. Eventually, the homeowner would not be able to make payments. They would fall behind, and then a series of late fees and penalties would take hold, leading to default, foreclosure, and then eventual seizure by the banks. There was 150,000 foreclosures in the city of Detroit over a period of about 4 years. So when you see what's going on out here, you can know that this was a contrived scheme on the part of the largest and most wealthiest financial institutions in this country as well as in the world. Now, many of the foreclosures and evictions were illegal, even according to the rules set out by the banks themselves. Options that should have been available to lower payments, to work out agreements with the banks, were disregarded in a mad rush for repossession of these homes. It later became clear that there were greater incentives for the banks to foreclose on these borrowers than work with them to resolve the payment issues. Most of these fraudulent mortgages were insured at the inflated rates of the mortgage as opposed to the actual market rate of the properties, which were rapidly declining in value. So that's what I mentioned before. The properties through the mortgages were insured at the mortgage rates, which were inflated, not at the market rate, because the value of the property started going down tremendously about 5 or 6 years ago. When foreclosures occurred, the banks would be paid in full value, plus penalties and fees by the insurers, and profit, of course, was made on both ends. What helped fuel the predatory lending frenzy was also the false notion that property values would continue to rise in perpetuity. And we heard this a lot a decade ago. Lenders would tell borrowers that they could always refinance and get lower interest rates and more cash. This, of course, turned out to be a big lie, because as soon as the system began to unravel in 2007 and property values plunged, no lender would be willing to refinance a home. People were stuck with homes that were declining in value, with high unreasonable mortgage payments, surrounded by communities that were being destroyed through the crisis. Now, this feeds in as well to the whole phenomena of the declining rate of wages among working people in general, and particularly among African Americans. Now let us look at some of the underlying factors that are clearly related to the crisis of housing in urban areas like Detroit. Since the 1970s, wages have been on a decline inside the United States, and there are studies that have been done on this. With large-scale deindustrialization in Detroit and other cities throughout Michigan, the problem of structural unemployment has become pronounced. This problem, in fact, goes back to the 1950s, when the general myth exists of an expanding economy with a burgeoning middle class is still promoted in the mass media and popular culture. So if you look at the U.S. Census reports, going all the way back to 1960, you can see that Detroit has been losing industrial jobs going all the way back to the 1950s. In Detroit, industrial jobs were being lost in the 1950s and 1960s, as the census reports document. This was taking place at the same time as the large-scale migration of African Americans into the city of Detroit was increasing, when many working-class and middle-class whites were fleeing the city for the suburbs. By the time of the 1967 rebellion, the decline in the city was well underway. Unemployment and underemployment was a major problem among youth in the African American community in Detroit in 1967, when approximately 40% of the city was black. So this myth that it was the 1967 rebellion that destroyed the city of Detroit is absolutely absurd, because the city of Detroit was already in decline economically and socially many years before 1967. Even the government census reports indicate this. But you hear it all the time, coming from whites and even from some African Americans. They will say, well, it was the riots that destroyed the city. No, actually the rebellions were actually a response to the economic decline inside the city. There was a minor recession in 1969, in the United States. And in 1971, under the Nixon administration, he embarked upon what was called an anti-inflation program that took the U.S. off the gold standard. By 1973 and 1974, major changes in the economic structure of the country resulted in plant closings and layoffs. So we start seeing major structural changes in 1973 and 1974 here in Detroit and around the country. This in part was the result of the October 1973 Egypt-Israeli war, which prompted the Arab oil embargo that brought about additional shocks in the petroleum industry, which resulted in price hikes and shortages of fuel. The problems of large-scale unemployment began during this period in the city of Detroit and in other industrial centers around the country, like Gary, Indiana, and many other places in Ohio, where you start seeing plant closing and long-term layoffs. In 1975, there was a major restructuring of the world economic system. Actually, the U.S., the entire capitalist world, really has not been the same since 1975. We're talking about a period of nearly 4 decades. An even greater degree of deindustrialization began to occur, where millions of people were thrust into the economic uncertainty and social displacement. These developments occurred within a broader international context. They had a tremendous impact on the United States. We have to remember what was going on in 1975. That was the same year that the Vietnam War ended, when the communists were based in North Vietnam and South Vietnam, took over the U.S.-backed government in Saigon and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. And the influence of Washington collapsed entirely throughout the entire region of Southeast Asia, in Laos as well as in Cambodia. Thailand, of course, still remained within the U.S. sphere. This had a tremendous impact on the United States socially, economically, as well as politically. I mean, it shattered the political will of the United States during the mid to late 1970s. Also that same year, the independence of Angola and Mozambique, 2 countries in southern Africa, crippled a major ally of the United States within NATO, and that was Portugal. Portugal was perhaps the poorest country in Europe, but it was a part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a part of this military alliance that came out of the Second World War. And the United States backed Portugal against the national liberation movements in Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau, which is also in West Africa. This brought about a crisis in Portugal itself that almost led to a revolution in 1975. Now, these factors were compounded with the fall of the Nixon administration the year before, in 1974, and the revelations surrounding the role of both the domestic intelligence services hampered the ability of the state to exercise a degree of repression that had been common since the Cold War, which began in 1947 and ended around, well, I guess in terms of the repression around 1974, there was some lifting of political repression because of the collapse of the Nixon administration, the revelations around Watergate, the collapse of U.S. intervention in Vietnam, the collapse of the former Portuguese colonies in Africa, and of course these revelations that came out about the role of the FBI and the CIA.